Welcome back, everybody. You may already know me. I am Summer Sherland. I'm probably your history professor, or you're working with me through your training or contributions to the South Phoenix Oral History Project. Today is the second half of our context lab. So yesterday or previously, we talked through how you fit into this kind of weird diagram that we chose about your story, and it connected to all these different historical or personal things that really impacted who you are and how you view yourself. And what it does is it makes you the expert of a particular time and place in local or national or global history. And that's sort of a good way to see your narrator as a representation of their own experiences, and helps you kind of develop some good questions about them and also their historical significance. So what I want to do today is demonstrate for you how one person's story can actually fold quite well into a historical narrative. And I'm going to use a well-known person for this. So because I'm calling it folding into a historical narrative, we're going to start by taking a piece of paper. And you can use notebook paper or construction paper or plain paper like mine, and folding it in half. If you're choosing to do this on your computer, on a Word document or a Google Doc, just draw a line or a column down the middle of the paper. So hot dog, not hamburger, paper in half. On one side, I want you to write the word context. And you know how I feel about context. Context is the most exciting thing to learn as a historian, but it's also one of the most difficult things to fully grapple with. So it's fun, it's exciting, it's engaging. It's this idea that like one person or one story or one thing actually fits within a broader scope of history. It's fascinating, right? But it's challenging. So on one side, I want you to write the word context, and on the other, I want you to write the words biographical details. So I'm going to tell you a story that's already been written, but this actually can help you with both writing your own questions for interviews, or if your interview's done and you want to write a story about your own narrator. So these are the two ways that you can use this activity. So what I want you to do is, taking your piece of paper with one side saying context and one side saying biographical detail, I want you to follow along with the story about Frederick Douglass. And as I do, I want you to try to identify examples of biographical details and context. The best way to look for context is just sort of historical events or historical information. And as I tell this story, I want you to try to keep track. When I do this in person, I have students sort of I have a prize for the person who has the most of both, but look for at least 5 historical events and 5 biographical details. So this is the story of Frederick Douglass. He was born, it's been determined, in sometime in February 1817. He later began celebrating on the 14th because at that time, he was this African-American little boy who was born into slavery, and slaves' birthdays weren't always recorded properly. So he ultimately celebrates on the 14th of February, which is Valentine's Day. He was born on the eastern shores of Maryland. And in 1817, this is 50 or so years, a few less than 50 years before the Civil War, and slavery was still 100% legal, and it was booming, even in Maryland. Maryland, which is kind of in that middle part of the Atlantic coast, was still considered the South. I mean, Washington, D.C. at the time was chosen as a city because it was in the South. He was born to a white father. He never knew his dad. His mother was a woman named Harriet Bailey, and she was a slave. At this time, slave women were commonly sexually exploited by white men. And this is in part because the slave trade, as we understand it, with these big ships coming from Africa, was abolished in 1794, about 20 years before Douglass was born. But slavery itself continued. And in fact, slave women were exploited so frequently by white men who were looking to expand their base of slaves. And so women were seen as always potentially victims of sexual assault, rape, and violence because in part their bodies were viewed as property, but they were also viewed as opportunities to promote more reproduction. Douglass had a difficult childhood. He was separated from his mother at a young age. He faced cruel conditions on the plantation, but he later wrote that his experiences, cruel that though they were no worse than any other slave had experienced at the time. He's a little bit older and he's sent to Baltimore, and he's working for a woman named Mrs. Alt. Now, Mrs. Alt was a Northern woman. She was not Southern, and she was unaccustomed to the conditions of slavery in the South. So she decides to teach Douglass, this young man, to read and write. Well, this was not legal, believe it or not. It was illegal for African Americans and slaves to be literate. It was outlawed across the country. So when Mr. Alt found out that Mrs. Alt was teaching this, little boy this young man to read, he put a stop to it. But Douglass continued educating himself. He once said, "You can never enslave an educated man." In 1938, Douglass ran away from Mrs. Alt's home in Baltimore. He chose to run because the North had outlawed slavery over 30 years prior in 1804. But in order to pass into the North, freed Blacks had to carry papers, identification papers, to prove their freedom. They had to show that they were no longer slaves. Well, Douglass ran away. He didn't have those kinds of papers, so he borrowed some and impersonated a colleague or a friend of a friend, an acquaintance. He impersonated that freed Black man on the passage north. When he gets to New York, he adopts the last name Douglass. So he doesn't change his name until the 1830s after he's arrived in New York City. And he gets the name Douglass because he married another escaped slave from the South. Here's what's happening in New York at the time. This is a big movement of anti-slavery or abolitionism. Beginning in the 1830s, there was this new fervor of spirituality and religion. And these movements for reform, for political reform, were tied to movements for sort of spiritual awakening in America. And this reform spirit personified the American North, especially in the cities. Religious leaders were kind of some of the loudest and most ardent critics of slavery because they saw that the moral and spiritual obligations to outlaw slavery were so significant, right? There was this widespread belief, and has been around since the really 15th century, 14th century, that Christians should never enslave other Christians. I mean, that's doctrine, that's in the Bible. And so you have these religious movements in the North, you have people becoming more sort of spiritually awakened, and they're tying their understanding of spirituality to this kind of moment of slavery in America. And they begin to reconcile, or they begin to see that these things cannot be reconciled. So that's what's happening morally and spiritually in New York. There were also economic and political forces at play. There were a lot of business leaders and politicians in the North who were very fearful of how powerful the South had become, both financially and politically. With westward migration, which happens like right away, but it becomes really significant in the 1830s. As more Americans move further west, they are bringing with them agricultural practices like cotton booming, right? Cotton plantation growing, right? They're bringing these as white Americans are moving further west, they are bringing with them agricultural practices like your regular everyday homestead farming, but also plantation cotton growing. With the invention of the cotton gin, you have more and more cotton that can be produced because more and more cotton can be extracted from the plants at a faster rate. Well, if you can do it faster, you need more land to grow more crop. So you've got these political leaders in the North who are like, whoa, the South is getting so powerful. They keep moving more people west and taking with them practices of slavery and agricultural dominance. But meanwhile, the Northern industry is booming. And, a lot of times I think it's easy in history to think, well, the North was good and they were anti-slavery, and the South was bad and they were pro-slavery. But what you have to understand is that what made the North so successful was manufacturing. And what they were manufacturing was clothing or cloth. And that cloth was cotton. And all that cotton was from the South. So the North and the South are actually locked into this like big, just tough situation where one cannot survive without the other. So Douglass, he's in the North, he's seeing all these like political movements and abolitionism, and he's seeing spiritual leaders, promote anti-slavery tenets, and he joins the abolitionist movement himself, and he begins publishing constantly. Remember, it's illegal for slaves to have learned to read and write. So it is very taboo for freed Blacks or runaway Blacks to begin publishing under their own name. He's speaking out constantly against slavery. Well, he becomes well known and he becomes a target, right? He becomes someone who people are looking to bring violence upon. But this is the time period. This kind of 1830s to the 1860s can be seen as what's called the antebellum. Now, antebellum is a French word, essentially meaning before a war, but the word antebellum itself has become so uniquely kind of attributed to the American era right before the Civil War that the word itself has ultimately come to mean increasing divisions and hostilities among Northerners and Southerners. And at this time, these hostilities sort of boil over. Slaves who have run away, like Frederick Douglass, face an imminent threat of capture. In the 1850s, there's this series of compromises that are made by Congress to appease the South and the North, and no one is really winning, but it's Congress's attempt to sort of navigate out of what will eventually become the Civil War. And one of those compromises is the Compromise of 1850, and it includes this provision that all runaway Blacks living in the North could and must be captured and returned to the South. And the northern states were expected to pay for this or accommodate this or make this happen or facilitate this. So even though you have northern states that are vehemently opposed to slavery, they're now on the hook for returning runaway slaves. They're also on the hook for returning people who are not necessarily runaway slaves, but they're freedmen in the first place. And where are they returning them to if these were freedmen anyway? These compromises, historians have argued for centuries, it seems, that these compromises ultimately made it so that that America was destined for civil war. And so this is the era, right? This is the time that Douglass, this runaway Black man who had a very short introduction or formal education, taught himself to read and write. He becomes the leading Black writer, author, and activist to witness and write about the Civil War and ultimately Reconstruction after the war ends. Frederick Douglass, I'm curious if you already knew about him. Some of you may have never even heard of him, but he's this like very well-known African-American leader. He's just not necessarily always talked about the same way we kind of take for granted the histories of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. But he's one of the first, he's one of the first African-American authors in American history. So what did you come up with? What did you have in terms of context? What did you have in terms of biographical details? Do you see how I'm able to weave or fold Douglass's well-known story into these like really big concepts? Here's some examples of context. Well, let's do biographical first. I shared with you when he was born. I shared with you some of the demographics of his mother and his father to a certain extent. I talked a little bit about Mrs. Alt, the woman who taught him to read and write, and that he educated himself. In 1838, he ran away. He impersonated a freedman. He married a woman and adopted the last name Douglass. And he becomes this significant writer and activist of the Civil War era. Okay, biographical details, right? But then I also told you what was going on and how it mattered to him or how it sort of fit him. I talked about slavery in the early 19th century. I talked about the sexual exploitation of Black women at the hands of white men. I discussed the outlaws or the legal conditions around training or teaching people to read and write that were slaves or former slaves. I described how the North had outlawed slavery in 1804 and that Blacks had to carry papers with them. We discussed anti-slavery, religion, economic, and political sort of forces around anti-slavery, and a little bit about the abolitionist movement, and then the antebellum period, including the Compromise of 1850 and westward migration. And that was all done in like about 500 words or so, maybe a little bit more. And you can do that too. So I'm curious, how would you do this for your own narrator? How would you describe his or her biographical details? How would you describe his or her or their historical context? You can use this sort of training to help you understand your narrator. It can also help you write useful interview questions. All right, if you have any questions, you can always email us at historysouthmountain@gmail.com. We are happy to talk with you about our context lab. See you next time.